The pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine continue to affect the world economy, which now confronts bleak and unpredictable futures. Numerous risks listed in the April World Economic Outlook, WEO, have already begun to manifest. But still, in this video, we'll show you the analysis of the GDP of the top countries in 2022 as regards the global economy. But first, please like and subscribe to this channel, and then sit back and relax. The gross domestic product, GDP, is one indicator of a nation's economic health, since it calculates the entire market value of the finished goods and services produced in a given period. It acts as a gauge of economic production. In other words, growth in a nation's GDP indicates more robust economic activity. Consequently, it is a developing nation. As we've already discussed, large nations with a sizable population typically have a high GDP. Because it is so big, some more businesses and corporations contribute to the growth of the nation. For a small nation with a small population to eclipse the economic output of 329 million Americans or 1,402 million Chinese must be quite challenging. This year has been significant. The global GDP now exceeds 100 trillion euros. Remember that the 2021 global GDP was close to 94 trillion, up from last year. Additionally, it was 88 billion in 2020. The global economy is predicted by the IMF to reach $104 trillion by the end of the year. Although there is a positive trend, there are still several challenges in the post-pandemic recovery. Recent wars and conflicts, supply chain constraints, and ensuing inflation. The GDP of each nation in 2022 is shown in this graph from Visual Capitalist, which uses data from the IMF. The 100 trillion world economy, global GDP 2022 map is what we refer to it as. The fact that just 4 nations, the United States, China, Japan, and Germany, account for more than half of global economic output is remarkable. To put it plainly, the U.S. has a GDP that is already higher than the sum of the GDPs of 170 other nations. Countries with leading economies. Since 1871, the United States has had the biggest economy on the planet. 25.19 billion euros are its GDP. Its strong economy is a result of many characteristics, including a culture that supports innovation and entrepreneurship, a diverse workforce, and one of the largest manufacturing sectors in the world, second only to China. Don't forget that the dollar is the most commonly utilized currency in international trade. Do you know that the GDP of Apple alone exceeds that of all of Africa? Even if China's growth has slowed recently, predictions still show that it will surpass the U.S. by 2030. With a GDP of 19.9 trillion euros, it accounts for around 25% of the global economy. Your advantages. The business services and government sectors are followed by the banking, insurance, and real estate sectors. Recall that 90% of China's natural resources, which total 23 trillion, are coal and rare earth metals. With a GDP of 4.87 trillion euros, Japan has the third largest economy in the world. Consumer demand, or the market, is what drives it. Its advantage stems from having the biggest electronics and auto industries in the world. As we have previously highlighted, it has a grim future due to a dwindling population and rising debt. Germany now has the biggest economy in Europe, overtaking the UK. It boasts one of the most highly skilled workforces and exports about 20% of the world's automobiles. Germany accounted for 28% of the euro area's economy, according to the IMF. The primary industries in the nation include vehicles, machinery, home furnishings, and chemicals. Spain, on the other hand, comes in at number 15 with a GDP of 1.39 billion euros. Let's now discuss the nations with the lowest economies. For many of the smaller economies around the world, the pandemic was disastrous. The final straw for them was inflation and food shortages brought on by the conflict in Ukraine. The World Bank estimates that the level of per capita income in developing nations will be 5% lower in 2022 than it was before the pandemic. The world's smallest economy in terms of GDP is Tuvalu, which has 65.6 million people. Its industry, which is situated halfway between Hawaii and Australia, depends on territorial fishing rights. The nation also generates considerable profits from its .tv web domain. As a result, it receives millions each year in licensing fees for the domain name from businesses like Twitch. Similar to Tuvalu, Oceania is home to many of the world's tiniest economies, such as Nauru, Palau, and Kiribati. A few of the earlier named nations also get more than a third of their jobs from the tourism sector. Some nations are also anticipated to have negative GDP growth this year as a result of the hostilities. For instance, Russia's GDP growth rate is predicted to be minus 8.5% in 2022, and the war and sanctions may worsen the country's economic outlook. Disasters, however, can also be advantageous. The Middle East and North Africa are one region that has seen recent growth because of increasing oil prices. Iraq and Saudi Arabia in particular are leading this transformation. In 2022, the region's GDP is projected to expand by about 5%. Yet, why is the rate of global economic growth declining? The worldwide inflation rate has been revised despite the slowdown in activity, in part because of increasing food and energy prices. According to upward revisions of 0.9 and 0.8 percentage points, respectively, inflation is projected to be 6.6% in advanced economies and 9.5% in emerging markets and developing economies this year. It is also expected to continue to be high for a longer period. Due to the prevalence of price pressures brought on by supply chain disruptions and historically tight labor markets, inflation has also widened in many economies. The risks to the forecast are primarily negative and include the following. The Russian gas supply to Europe could abruptly end as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. Another argument is that if labor markets remain overly tight, inflation expectations drift, or disinflation proves to be more expensive than expected, high inflation could become entrenched. Additionally, tighter financial circumstances may cause developing and emerging market economies to experience greater debt difficulty. Lockdowns and any COVID-19 outbreaks could further restrain China's economic growth. Food insecurity and a general sense of malaise may be brought on by rising food and energy prices. Additionally, geopolitical fragmentation may hinder international cooperation and trade. In a different scenario, in which some of these risks, such as a complete halt to the flow of Russian gas to Europe, could very well occur, inflation would increase and global growth would slow down even more to about 2.6% this year and 2% next year, a rate below which growth has only fallen 5 times since 1970. The United States and the Euro region both endure close to zero growth in this scenario, with devastating repercussions for the rest of the world. The challenges facing the global economic growth. The authorities must give it a top priority to bring inflation back to the levels that central banks have set as their targets, because at its current levels it poses a risk to both present and future macroeconomic stability. Many emerging markets and developing economies had already begun rising interest rates last year, but in response to the fresh statistics, central banks in the world's most advanced economies are reducing monetary support earlier than anticipated in April. Slowdowns in both global GDP and inflation are anticipated as a result of the unprecedented coordinated monetary tightening that has resulted globally over the past year. Real economic consequences will inevitably result from tightening monetary policy, but delaying it will simply make the problems worse. The procedure will need to be continued by central banks that have already started it until inflation is under control. The consequences on those who are most disadvantaged can be mitigated by targeted financial aid. However, balancing targeted support with tax increases or public spending reductions will help to ensure that fiscal policy does not further complicate the role of monetary policy given the budgetary pressures governments are already under from the pandemic and the need for a generally deflationary stance of macroeconomic policy. Financial conditions are becoming more restrictive, particularly for emerging market countries, as established economies boost interest rates to fight inflation. To protect financial stability, nations must deploy macroprudential instruments as needed. The authorities should be ready to carry out foreign exchange interventions or employ capital flow management measures in a crisis if exchange rate flexibility is insufficient to absorb external shocks. These issues arise at a time when many nations are struggling with a shortage of fiscal room. 60% of low-income countries are currently in or are on the verge of entering a serious debt crisis, up from 20% 10 years ago. Even additional challenges will be presented by rising borrowing prices, dwindling credit flows, a stronger dollar, and poorer economic growth. As a result of the challenges in obtaining coordinated agreements among numerous creditors against conflicting claims, debt resolution methods continue to be slow and unpredictable. Although recent developments in the adoption of the Group of 20 Common Framework are encouraging, further progress is still desperately required. The most impacted individuals must be the focus of domestic initiatives that address the effects of energy and food shortages while preventing price inflation. Instead of stockpiling food and energy, governments should work to remove trade restrictions like restrictions on food exports that raise global prices. Governments must intensify vaccination programs, eliminate bottlenecks in vaccine distribution, and guarantee equal access to care as the pandemic spreads. Finally, swift multilateral action is still needed to reduce emissions and boost investment to hasten the transition to a green economy and mitigate climate change. Governments are under pressure to use fossil fuels as a band-aid because of the conflict in Ukraine and the skyrocketing cost of electricity. Authorities and regulators must make sure that such actions are momentary, taken exclusively to make up deficits, and done so without raising emissions overall. To enhance the supply of green energy, credible and comprehensive climate measures must be pushed forward right away. The current energy crisis also shows how national security objectives can coexist with a clean energy independence program. Since April, the prognosis has significantly worsened. Just 2 years after the previous recession, the world may soon be heading toward another one. On many challenges, from the transition to a more sustainable climate and pandemic preparedness to food security and debt crisis, international cooperation will be crucial. The greatest strategy to improve economic prospects and lower the likelihood of a downturn remains to strengthen international collaboration in the face of these significant obstacles and struggles. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, the subscription button, and the notification bell. To get notified when new videos are uploaded from this channel, please share your thoughts about the 2022 global economy, statistics of the GDP of top countries in the world in 2022 in the comment section below. Thank you.